Real story that a mother shared with me. She's also a Des Moines public school teacher, actually, and she said this to me one day. She said, "I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I'd worried about what she'd be taught, like I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when she came home, she was so excited about everything that she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter turned to me and said, 'You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white.'" And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So let's imagine this child was Latina. And she comes home after school, a day of celebrating a Latina justice leader, and she says, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas." I don't think her mom's response would have been, "Oh no, oh my God," right? Or let's imagine, very possibly, that some African American children in that actual second grade class had gone home that day and said, "You know what, Dad? I'm so glad we're Black." I can imagine many a father in that situation saying, "Indeed, we are glad we're Black." But the landscape, the terrain is different when we start talking about white children.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Why.te Stories, and yet it's a new week and a good day. So I'm hoping that we are going to learn from each other. So today's video is about, we are trying to educate each other, try to learn from each other. So my question to you as viewers, probably know you are parents, or if you're not parents, you may be parents very soon, or you had children and maybe they are older right now, right? So the question I would like to ask you is, how often do you engage your children when it comes to racial things? How often do you educate them about race, about the importance of race? Because we are taught to be colorblind, and if you get to look at it deeply, that's generally majorly where the problem starts. We need to teach our children to be culturally, to be racially aware of themselves, of racial sensitivity towards other people and towards other things. And generally, there is this theory, it's called social racial theory. The social racial theory states that in the Black families, you find that the Black families, it is easier for them to talk about race, to their children. While in the white family, they always don't talk about race, they don't teach their children about race. And that's why you find things like racial insensitivity, where a child comes home and says that, "Mom, Dad, I'm glad we are white, you know." Okay, there is no problem by saying I am white, you know. But look at the society where the children are raised. That's why racial education is important to kids, you know. And I applaud this to the Black family for always standing up, teaching their children about this, and also for the few white families who they have taken to themselves to talk to their children about this. So you find that in this society, this is a society which is a white privileged society. So the conundrums in the head, like something like guilt, that's why they don't like it, or they have some issue when they say that, "Oh, I'm proud to be white," you know. So that's where the issue comes from, because of the guilt that is subconscious. But you see, if a Black person says that, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I'm glad we're Black," they're proud, right? So you get to understand the difference. So if you come from a society where children are not taught about race, and this may lead them not to become racial sensitive, they'll become racial insensitive to other people, to other children, and they are the product of society. And so it begins with the parents. Look, when John Locke wrote about this theory, about the looking glass theory, every child is born a blank slate. With time, they consume things which are in the environment. So when they consume things which are in the environment, it means that if we don't teach them well, if we don't tell them things well, because the United States, especially with children, racial matters are so sensitive because it is the fabric that directs everything, from economics, from politics, from everything. So we want to grow our children in this type of environment. So racial education is important when it comes to staying in these societies. So I hope that this video will be so helpful to you, and we are going to learn as parents. And if you are a black parent who don't have time with your kids, teaching them about what really they can understand about themselves, because in a broader spectrum, we need to educate both parties. So this is your presenter, Jintoki Stories, and thank you for always tuning in. I'm glad that you're doing fine, and I just want us to watch the video. And if you're watching this video for the first time, you can always consider subscribing to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, let's dive right into the video.
Does that sound okay? Good. Darcy, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And on behalf of Surge as well, I'm so grateful for the Surge leadership team and we have many folks in Surge who are deeply committed and taking leadership in this work in Des Moines. So it's really exciting to me to be partnering with Plymouth. Thank you so much, Reverend Braun, for opening the doors and saying, yes, let's do this work. It strikes me as perfect because my entry into anti-racist work, which began a very long time ago, began with activism and advocating for structural change and learning how to do that from people of color in New York City. And there was a long period of time in my life where I thought, oh yeah, and then when we talk about like how we talk to kids or each other, that's all the touchy-feely stuff. I'm not so interested in that. Like, let's just go out on the streets, right? And here I find myself 20 years later and writing a book about parenting. And there's been a few moments in that journey where I've thought, this is sort of that touchy-feely stuff I used to think was not so important, but it's deeply important. And I realized in my own life and journey as a white person, trying to find words and embodiment for anti-racism, how much the ways I was raised had impeded my journey in many ways, even though I was raised by very well-intentioned, good white people, right? And so what I love about this event this morning, and I love about you all being here and us meeting each other, is that internal, familial, community, multi-generational conversations and modeling and teaching is actually deeply connected to structural challenges to systems of white supremacy, and they go hand in hand. We need to do both. And so this event this morning, we're going to talk about some of the touchy-feely stuff for a while, and we're going to have the opportunity then to bring it back to, we've prepared some calls to action that are sort of pathways that Surge has, in partnership with with several different organizations here, developed, that we're going to leave with you today and hopefully continue together on a journey towards showing up. Even for those of us for whom Sunday nights aren't a great time to come to a meeting. We have lots of ways folks can plug into anti-racist white accountability in Des Moines. So we're going to end our time this morning with that, but we're going to have lots of time for dialogue in between here and there. So I want to start, even though this doesn't look like a book, what I'm reading or what I'm going to share is all straight from my book. I just don't trust myself to read this big of font from a stage anymore because of this. So this is, I just want to mostly share some stories today to map out some of the terrain that I think those of us who have children in our lives, which does not necessarily mean we are parents. Most people in society in some way, shape, or form bump into raising kids, right? Whether it's neighbors' kids, clergy, coaches, because we're adult modeling in a grocery store and a kid sees us. We're all raising children. And I think we need to find some different terrain to stand on in that work, especially if we have white children in our purview, in our spheres of influence. So I want to share some stories that map some of the opportunities about that, but also some of the challenges that I think we will become better equipped to understand and respond to when we can name, right? If we can name challenges, we can strategize together how we move through them. So here's the first story. This is a real story that a mother shared with me. She's also a Des Moines public school teacher, actually. And she said this to me one day. She said, "I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I'd worried about what she'd be taught. Like, I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when she came home, she was so excited about everything that she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter turned to me and said, 'You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white.' And I thought, oh my God, do we say that?" So let's imagine this child was Latina. And she comes home after school, a day of celebrating a Latina justice leader, and she says, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas." I don't think her mom's response would have been, "Oh no, oh my God," right? Or let's imagine, very possibly, that some African American children in that actual second grade class had gone home that day and said, "You know what, Dad? I'm so glad we're black." I can imagine many a father in that situation saying, "Indeed, we are glad we're black." But the landscape, the terrain is different when we start talking about white children. Because of this, if you are committed to equity, if you are committed to justice, but you live in an unjust society that also privileges you in that injustice, you face some very real conundrums. Conundrums that we can hear in a sentence like, "I'm so glad we're white." Oh my God, do we say that? These conundrums impact white children's development from the earliest days of their lives, from birth. Now, of course, race impacts all children's development, and all of our children need support in order to navigate a society that is simultaneously incredibly diverse, but deeply racially unjust, okay? We know that all of our children need that support if we want them to develop what we might call, quote unquote, healthy racial identities, which in and of itself is a complicated notion when you're living in a white supremacy, right? And we can talk about that in our discussion time. But we also know, while all of our children need that support, that in families where children of color are being raised, children of color tend to get some of that support or more of that support. So we know, for example, from studies, that parents of children of color teach their kids explicitly about the ways that race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white families. In contrast to that, we know that 75% of white families with kindergartners, so age 5, hold on to that age, it's a significant age, never, quote, never or almost never talk about race with theirs. So I think it's important to think about that as a profound generational white silence. Most of us who are of this age, I'm in my 40s, before this and after this, most of us have been raised with profound white silence at best when it comes to race, and it's impacted us deeply. So this morning I want to talk a little bit about what white silence looks like so we can recognize it when we see it, a little bit about the reasons that it's so dangerous. I'm going to give you some examples of the dangers, and then more importantly, we're going to talk about some counter responses, some things that we need to learn to do even as we embrace the awkward of it. So I'm wondering if any of you saw the story last spring of the 2 4-year-old boys who were best friends. Did you see it? One of the boys was white and one of them was African American, and they got matching haircuts. They got matching haircuts so that they could fool their teacher and she wouldn't know who was who. Did you see it? Some of you saw it. It was like all over the internet. It was on actual TV, which does still exist, TV media. It was like wildfire flying through the US social landscape. And I think in part it was because it was such a sweet story. It was a very lovely friendship. It was a very moving friendship to see these 2 little boys say, "Yeah, we're going to trick our teachers." You know, they clearly loved each other deeply. So that's one of the reasons it was so picked up and consumed. But the other thing that occurred to me as this story was getting all this airtime was that it had caught on because it seemed to be evidence that white silence is a good strategy. So it seemed to be proof that kids can be taught not to see color, right? That's why those 4-year-olds thought their teacher wouldn't be able to tell them apart. I was raised by a female doctor, and I used to tell people when I was 4 that women could only be nurses. So that's not what was going on for these kids, I'm convinced. And B, that if we could teach kids not to see color, that would be a good thing. I don't believe that would be a good thing. But the mother of the white boy's mom, actually, I heard her tell the media that his, quote, inability to see difference was a parental success because, she said, I just taught him to love everyone the same. Now, those words do sound very, very nice, and I deeply believe in modeling for my kids and wanting to teach my kids, I have a 7- and 9-year-old, that we need to love everyone. So my concern with this story is not against that message. My concern is that I just taught him to love everyone the same is actually a really seductive but veiled white silence teaching. It's the epitome of colorblind teaching, right? Just love everyone the same, don't see difference. But I think we would be more equipped to challenge colorblindness if we started calling colorblindness white silence, because that's really what it is, okay? So we know that I just taught him to love everyone the same is a dangerous form of white silence because there was a study of about 100 families in 2006. And in 2006, this 100 families said, I want to be in this study because our approach to race in our family is to teach our kids everybody's equal. These were equity-committed families. And they self-reported that the way they taught equity was to insist to their kids and explicitly teach over and over, everybody's equal, everybody's equal. And the researchers who did this study sat down with the kids at one point, and they asked them a very blunt question. They said to these kids being raised in everybody's equal families, do your parents like black people? 38% of the children in these families said, I do not know. 14% of these kids said, nope, my parents don't like black people. So it turns out that everybody's equal or love everyone the same is so abstract that children literally have no idea what it means. They don't have any idea they're supposed to be connecting that to actually valuing people, whatever their skin tone, hair texture, accents, names. And more frighteningly to me is that everybody's equal. We have all kinds of evidence to show it does nothing to counteract racism in kids. So before I give a couple of examples of how this silence shows up and why it's so dangerous, which will be clear in these examples, I really want to say, again, this is not just a parenting problem, which is why it's critical, I think, that we engage in these dialogues in all of the spaces that we are part of. Because this is as I already said, a number of adults are involved when it comes to raising kids, right? It's a generational work, right? It's not just about parents. But it's also not just about white kids, because white adults are or are not able to say or to ask or to engage in conversations about race in particular ways with the kids in our lives directly because of where we may be in our own lives around these issues, right? And for those of us that have been raised in white silence then, part of our challenge in engaging kids and perpetuating white silence is that we ourselves have not yet developed facility with talking about race. And so this is not a conversation that's just about children. It's about where adults are too. The other thing is it's not at all only about white kids. And that perhaps is the most important thing for us to be aware of. We need to deeply understand that white silence impacts children of color, and then teenagers of color, and then 20-somethings of color, and then my colleagues at Drake, right? As those children of color come into contact with white children, and then white teenagers, and then white 20-somethings, and then white colleagues at Drake. So this is a multiracial conversation because it impacts people of color dramatically, right? As well as impacting white kids. So I want to give you two stories that sort of model why white silence is so dangerous, what it results in, okay? The first is going to be kind of a pass looking at kids, younger kids. The second will be the pass at the sort of teenager dimension of things. So we know from numerous studies that children internalize racist perceptions, all children, racist perceptions of themselves and others, starting by the ages of 3 and 4 very likely even earlier, but we can document it starting at ages 3 and 4. By age 5, remember the 5 kindergarten white families say we don't talk about it. By age 5, kids recognize that different racial groups are treated differently, and they actually understand something about racial social status in the United States. The other thing that's very significant, they also know by age 5 that they are not supposed to talk about this in front of adults. So there was a study of preschoolers about 12, 13 years ago now, and this study found that over and over again, kids, young kids, 3, 4, would play with larger social messages about race, messages that most adults assume just goes right over kids' heads. And one example that really stood out to me in this book that I read, this is the researcher's language, not mine. She says, there's a white girl pulling 2 other girls, one white, one Asian, in a wagon. The wagon gets stuck, and the Asian girl jumps out to help. The white girl responds, quote, "No, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon." Renee has her hands on her hips. She frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists, only white Americans are permitted to do this task. So this is a very sophisticated way of playing with white racial assumptions about citizenship, being used and communicated by a 4-year-old. It's really sophisticated. We might be being tempted right in this moment to go, well, oh my God, what are they teaching that kid at home, right? Until I had kids, that's what I used to default to. Like, oh, well, that's clearly the parents are screwing something up. Maybe, okay, but maybe not. And so I want to actually encourage us to resist that. Because it's often not how this works, right? It's easy to think that when kids manifest racism, that's caused by a few rogue bad adult apples, right? We're much wiser to understand racism as smog. Okay, this is Beverly Daniel Tatum's idea. Tatum says racism is smog. We're breathing it in all the time, every day of our lives from birth, right? From probably before birth. White silence is basically the equivalent of deciding that you're going to send your 3-year-old out into smog but not give him or her a breathing mask. And so white silence is just as likely to result in a wagon story like that as is explicit messaging at home that only white Americans should have certain kinds of rights. You don't need to do that to have a child who's 4 say, only white Americans, right? Smog is that powerful. I know that smog is that powerful very well because my kids are being raised by 2 moms. Both of us are not particularly gender conforming. We are deeply anti-sexist, at least trying to be, and committed to feminism. And I could tell you the number of stories of my 2 kids saying sexist things at home, right? And I know it's not coming from us, at least not explicitly. My favorite nightmare is when my older child was 4. She's now 9, but when she was 4, my daughter said to me that God had to be a man because God is obviously a boy's name, is what she said. I was like, well, I might not be able to argue with that one. Give me some theology, but that, I don't, But then she said, much more sobering, she said to me, direct quote, God has to be a boy because boys are better than girls. She was 4. Hashtag feminist religious studies scholar mom fail. To date, my longest Facebook therapy session of my life was like 500 comments by the time I finally breathed. And that wasn't, I know she didn't get that from us. It's smog, right? And she even has a breathing mask. Okay, so here's the teenager version of what white silence can produce that I want to put on the table for us. And I encountered this before 2016, before the presidential election. This story now gives me chills, and it always gave me chills, but now it really gives me chills, especially post-Charlottesville. Another researcher, Mary Buckles, spent a year doing interviews in a very, very racially diverse high school in Northern California. A high school actually committed to diversity and multiculturalism in their curriculum. So this was not a place they were trying to be silent about race. And she started each interview by asking students their age, their sex, gender, their race, their ethnicity, pretty straightforward stuff. But something fascinating happened. White students literally couldn't answer the last part. They were fine on the age, sex, grade question, but when she would ask them their race or their ethnicity, they would start to squirm. And so she said some of them would give her ironic answers. So there was this one boy she writes about, and they're just sort of talking, he's personable, and then all of a sudden when he gets to the race part, she said, he abruptly took on a fake British accent and goes, "I'm the whitest of the white boys." And she's sort of like, okay, that was really awkward. But she's like, what's going on? He's kind of mock celebrating his whiteness as like, oh, the whitest of the white boys, not quite sure what to do with it. And other students, other white students, students of color did not struggle with this part of the question. They would play ignorant or they would get uncomfortable. And so they would say things like, well, I'm white. And then they'd go, I guess. And they'd kind of qualify it. Or they'd say, I don't know, I'm white. Not sure. So as she pushes on this, Buchholz discovers two things. One is that these students literally are not sure if saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be that. And so they start to squirm just with this demographic question. That's a really, really big problem, developmental problem. The other thing is she finds that there's a discourse in the school, and I've seen this firsthand in some ways even at Drake, that associates whiteness with, quote, cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. Okay? And this is not just white kids, students of color in the school as well. This is the conversation. White kids are just uncool, culturally bland. And sometimes when white students will report this, it's kind of a joke. They think it's kind of funny. But other times it's very clearly very painful to them. And this is really important because think about high school. I'm sure no one in this room was uncool in high school. But imagine that age where uncool is about the most frightening thing you can be for some of us, right? And you're in a context where you're being told you're supposed to celebrate and value diversity. Good, right? But everybody knows, but probably no one's really talking about it, that doesn't mean you're supposed to celebrate your diversity, your whiteness. Like that, oh my God, are we supposed to say that part, right? So you cannot embrace your race, but everyone else not only gets to embrace theirs, but you're supposed to enjoy them embracing theirs, and they're much cooler on top of that, all the while, right? What do we think is going to happen in this context? Well, what Buchholz discovers happens is that these white youth in this multicultural diversity-committed curriculum are completely resentful, but they don't turn their resentment on the teachers or the adults in their lives who have not enabled them to engage this dialogue. They are resentful at the whole project of diversity, and more connected but deeply frightening, they are angry at their peers of color, right? It's like a breeding ground for white racial hostility against students of color. So everybody's been set up to fail in this context. And again, this was before 2016, so imagine how frustrated, angry, somewhat confused, under-supported white youth in this context see something like Charlottesville, and we know these groups are on the move. I deeply, deeply worry, I'm not being histrionic, that these kinds of vortexes, our youth are kind of ripe for the picking for some of what's going on politically in the country right now. So we have to get urgently active now. Even with, we can't all start with babies now, right? But we've got to intervene and figure out what we need to do to start supporting youth to develop anti-racist identities. So here's what I want to sort of offer then, about like 3 examples of how some of the strategies we need to think about and start to develop with each other. We have to actually create these. Most of us have not had a lot of mentors and models for this, so I've thought through some ideas, and I'm trying some things with my own kids and with colleagues and friends and other parents and adults in my life, but really this is work we have to do together because a lot of this has not yet been mapped. But this is about raising a generation of quote-unquote healthy white kids for the good of all of our children, right? It's urgent. So here's what a few sort of examples of where and how I think we need to think about breaking white silence. The first is, and I'm not going to say much about this right now, but we can talk more about it in the discussion if it pertains to some folks, is we need to, from the youngest of ages, these amazing, gorgeous babies in this room, we need to create in our kids race and justice conscious schemas, okay? So an analogy for me on this front is, again, my kids who are being raised by 2 moms, I'm not going to wait and when they're 13 sit them down and say to them, let me tell you a secret. Heterosexism is a thing, and some families are different, right? That's just a strange thing to say, right? No, from birth they knew you could have multiple moms. They knew that before they even knew the word mom, right? We need to do the same thing with race. We need to, with our youngest children, enable them to know, by doing it with them, that it's fine and good to notice race. That is absolutely critical for them to learn early because they are going to be onslaughted with colorblind messaging from all over the place. We need them to know from the youngest of ages that racism is a real thing, and deeply important, we need from birth and on them to know and hear from us and see from us that people are constantly resisting racism and challenging it. We need to get them in all kinds of spaces where people are doing that so that they know that that is a vision for the future. They have that on board even before they have words to talk about it. So that's a piece of what race and justice conscious schemas are. We can talk more about some of the strategies we do that, but schemas have to do with what our kids just early think is normal. We need to make noticing race, awareness of racism, and visible anti-racism part of their schema, their basic assumptions for life from the moment they take in air, okay? Secondly, we need to recognize and think about the ways in our own lives and in the lives of our kids that racial scripts as in a play, are deeply powerful and are oftentimes one of the things going on when we try and have multiracial collaborations, coalitions. Racial scripts are very, very powerful. So I have heard many white adults talk about, especially parents, having put their kids in diverse spaces in their lives because they valued diversity, only to be disappointed that their children were unable to sustain friendships with kids of color. In some ways, this was my own experience. I went to Denver Public Schools because my parents wanted me there, and then after a while, they were like, well, this didn't work, right? So one of the things we need to come to terms with is that whatever our individual and our unique stories, personalities, commitments, identities, that we are all living in a larger racial story. Our lives are unfolding in it. It was written it started being written long before any of us got here, and it keeps being rewritten every day. It's about the collective piece. So I've been handed a role in this script. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that for almost 10 years in New York City, I did anti-police brutality organizing in the 90s. It doesn't matter that I did that the day after yet another unarmed African-American person is killed by police. When I walk down the street in Des Moines, if I encounter a black person who doesn't know me, I am just another white person on the street. Because all of that trauma and that violence and those wounds, it's in the air between us. It mediates our relationship until proven otherwise. And for many of us, many times, what's in the air between us prevents us from ever going beyond a first encounter across white lines and African-American lines, or white lines and Latino lines. So racial scripts are about this collective dimension, and our kids are not immune from it. So we need to know that. If my daughter, who's 9, is only ever taught that police are safe, that's all I tell her. Police are safe. If you're ever in trouble, go find one. But her 11-year-old cousin who's black, who is necessarily being taught police are complicated, right? Over time, their friendship will not remain deep and authentic because she'll be unable to identify with him. They can be best friends now at 9 and 11, and they are. That will go away if that's all I ever teach my daughter, right? So my 9-year-old's got to learn, relative to her own experience, some of the same truths that her cousin is learning, right? Or else they won't stay friends. Here's another kind of funny story about racial scripts. This happened, my other nephew, when he was about 5, who attends a very racially diverse school in Des Moines, and he was talking to my sister and I one night over family dinner about having played dodgeball at school that day. And he announced to us, he's really funny, he's really smart, and he's really bold, and he always puts the provocation right in the middle of the room so every adult knows, we're not going to pretend this isn't happening, he'll say it. And so he says at dinner, he said, yeah, so we're not supposed to say at dodgeball, black kids against the white kids. And we laughed. He himself is African-American. And then we asked him, said, but do you know why you're not supposed to say that? And he was like, nope. They didn't tell us that. And I suspect that some of what was going on was a kind of developmental naivety among these kids. You know, we do girl-boy stuff all the time. Why not white-black? So we should revisit that at some point. But I think also there was probably an emerging racial tension awareness going on among these 5-year-olds. And I was sad that the teachers hadn't felt supported and equipped enough to engage that with their classes, because I fear that the silence that resulted leaves those kids more likely to square off as black and white. They're going to figure out how to do that in some other way. If it's not dodgeball, it'll be something else. Those children have been handed roles, and they're becoming aware of that already by age 5. So I was trying to imagine when this happened, any number of conversations that could have leaned into a race and justice conscious schema like, well, what an interesting idea. What made you think of that? Let's talk about that as a class, right? Or, well, what about white kids and black kids who are friends? Would you let them play on each other's teams? Or, okay, but how do we know who's black and white? Like, what about kids who have families who are black and white? Or what about kids who are Latino? Or what about kids who are from Vietnam? Do they get to play? And whose team are they going to be on? And why? Let's talk about that together. What an interesting, amazing conversation with 5-year-olds that would have been. Interesting idea. Where else do you see black and white divided up and going against each other? Does that happen in Des Moines? Does it happen in our school? Do we want that to be how school is? And if not, what do we need to do to help change that, right? 5-year-olds could have that conversation. So I want to be really clear. I am not suggesting that we let kids play racially divided dodgeball. I do not think that's a good idea. Don't tweet that. But this is a prime opportunity, an example of a prime opportunity for race and justice conscious dialogue with young kids that we could do if, quite frankly, adults would just stop freaking out and stop underestimating what our kids can handle, because they can handle it. Okay, 2 more stories. This one is about me and my actual white kid when she was about 4. And this is about race being in our bodies. We were at Chuck E. Cheese, you know, that bastion of hell, Chuck E. Cheese. I thought being a lesbian mom is hard enough. We should get a pass on Chuck E. Cheese, but we don't. We still have to go too. And we were there for a birthday party when she was 4, and it was really, really, really crowded, like that horrible crowded where you're just bumping into people. It was mostly white people there, but there was a group of African-American kids who were running around immensely enjoying themselves. And it was a very short amount of time before I could feel racial dynamics happening in our bodies at Chuck E. Cheese. And so what I observed was white adults were kind of giving really quick glances at these kids who were running around. And they weren't hostile glances, but they definitely were. They weren't the kind of glances you would see them give a white child in the space who they also didn't know. It was just, they were just kind of like watching them quickly glance at the corner of their eye. And I definitely noticed a pronounced avoidance of eye contact and physical contact with these kids. And it was very strange because the space was so crowded that one of the ways as humans, when we're in crowded space, like if 3 of us went through that doorway right there, we would, at the same time, we'd be like, oh, we're gonna figure out who's going first by making some eye contact and acknowledging each other. And it's not always verbal. Well, this wasn't happening at all. So a kid would bump into an adult, and the adult would just sort of keep going as if it hadn't happened. It was very, it was like we were in racial bubbles. So at one point, my daughter and I stepped up to play a game, or she was gonna play a game, and a child, he was probably about 9, he stepped up at the exact same moment. He didn't make eye contact with us. We were gonna have to figure out who was gonna play first. Before I even thought any of that through, he happened to have this really incredible haircut. He had designs shaved into his hair that were just gorgeous. And I stopped him and I said, oh my gosh, I love your haircut. And for a second, he looked startled, and then he broke into a huge smile, and he turned and he said, thanks. And then we all made contact and smiled, and I don't remember who played the game first. But what happened was, for the next hour, this 9-year-old child and some of the kids he was with chased my daughter E around Chuck E. Cheese. And they kept coming up to her and shoving tickets in her hands. You know those like precious Chuck E. Cheese tickets? Every time they would win a game, they would be like, okay, where is she at? And they would like run, and they were giving my daughter tickets. She came home like with all of this amazing plastic landfill from Chuck E. Cheese because they gave her so many tickets. I mean, like hundreds, I'm not exaggerating. And she was just beaming because she was 4, And all these older kids are just showering her with love, which to her 4-year-old self was like, oh my gosh, these big kids think I am awesome, right? That was the only interracial interaction I saw at Chuck E. Cheese that whole afternoon. And I wasn't writing my book at the time, but I reflected on it later, and I wrestled with it. And I don't know for sure what was going on, and it's dangerous to talk about. I'm not trying to interpret this child's experience. I didn't talk to him about it, so I want to really flag that. But it was very clear to me that something was welcome about our interaction. For me, I felt the relief of getting out of the white racial bubble. I hate what it feels like in there. And I hadn't gone in intending that, but that's what happened. And then for whatever reason, whatever this child had anticipated when I started to speak, his exuberance afterward, again, left me believing something welcome had happened for him. And I think, no 9-year-old usually gives up their Chuck E. Cheese ticket, so I think that's a safe assumption, even if I don't exactly know what it was. But I share this story because it illustrates race as a body thing, right? We can create racial tension or connection with our bodies, with our eye contact. It doesn't take words, it doesn't take ideas. We can increase or reduce tension in all these ways. And in that space, my 4-year-old was experiencing white silence in her body. And then because of the generosity of this child, she experienced the disruption of racial separation and tension in a bodily way that was significant for her. Now, she doesn't remember this. This will go away for her unless I commit to sustained places, spaces, and relationships where we're disrupting that embodiment. But I left knowing that had been significant for her, to experience us saying, no, we're not staying in this sort of divided space. Okay, so finally, the last story I want to tell is about having to commit to the hard work of breaking our children's hearts if we have white children in our lives. So about a year ago now, another mother and I were talking about the nation's racial climate. We were lamenting this, and she nodded towards her white child and she said, I'm just so grateful she doesn't have to worry about any of this yet. Which I totally get. I get it. Because like anyone with kids in your lives in this room and outside of this room, we all want to protect our children. And we are indeed living in violent, difficult times. And I also want my kids to have a hope about the world. I want them to believe that the world is full of possibility. But what I'm wrestling with still, I'm wrestling with this every day, is that there is nothing innocent about white innocence, even in a 3-year-old, even in a 4-year-old. There's nothing innocent about white innocence. And the truth is that in the face of racial injustice, when we keep white kids innocent, we're actually bartering away their humanity. We're teaching them not to be human. I learned this really powerfully from my kids, most powerfully, probably the most moment I can capture it, in fall of 2016. Some of my students at Drake were organizing a protest, and I said to my 2 daughters, who were, I think, 7 and 5 at the time, remember when those 2 men were killed by police? My students are coming together to protest and to make clear they want this to stop, and I'm going to go, and I'll take you if you want to go. And both of them said to me, oh yeah, we want to go. And then they said, can we make signs? And I was like, sure. What are your signs going to say? And in unison, they both just said, Black Lives Matter. And I was like, oh, okay. Great, go make those signs. So I've taken my kids to protest their whole lives. But by now, they're old enough to understand more of what's going on than they did when I would take them when they were babies and 3. And so they chant, and they were engaged, and they had a sense of what was going on. And they participated and spent nearly an hour physically present with Black people and Latino people and other people of color and some white people who were standing together just to say no and be outraged and grieve together. And there they saw young people being brave and loud about the value of their own lives and their right to be free. And they experienced adults and these same young people asking them about their signs and affirming them for making their voices heard. And all of this was really powerful for their development, specifically their experience of having some anti-racist agency in the world. Like I could see them realizing, this is a thing I can do, I can fight, right? And so that was how the story ended. But the middle part of the story is where I learned what it means a bit to let my children have their hearts broken. So what happened was I had gone downstairs to tell my kids it was time to go. And when I came in the room, I just lost my breath when I saw my older child's sign. H's sign said, this, and it was green and red and had hearts and stars all over it. It said, "Black lives matter, M-A-T-E-R. They matter the same as white. Stop killing them." And then below that, she'd written the names of people in her life who she loves, and her sign put it this way: people that are black, B-L-A-K, are T, her cousin, A, her other cousin, and Toby, her aunt. And as you can imagine, I didn't just catch my breath. I literally felt my heart shatter into about 5 million pieces. But what I remembered as I sat in that moment and observed that devastating, gorgeous sign was that these are not days in which any of us dare live without a broken heart. Because if our hearts aren't broken right now, then we're already lost, because we've already lost a core part of our humanity. And so what I've held on to since that day is another devastating but gorgeous recognition, and that's this: that at this point, my 9-year-old, then 8, is a whole and wonderful and smart and kind and beautiful and very happy child. She doesn't wake up despairing about the world most days. But she's also, and in her not quite old enough to get it way, living with a broken heart. And I think one of the most important parts about that is that she also knows that. My partner and I have never said to her, we would never have said it this way, we've never done it. We've never said, your aunt and your cousins are black. Police violence puts their lives in danger. But by fall of 2016, she'd put the pieces together for herself. She knows racism is real. She knows it has real consequences for real people. And she knows that some of her most beloveds are among those people. And so she knew exactly what the stakes were in the protest. Exactly. So the thing is, as devastating as that moment was, I want nothing more than for my kids' hearts to stay exposed, because that's how they stay human. And so while there's so much uncharted territory here, things we need to figure out together, truthfully recognizing most of us have had few models, this is very scary, this is very hard, but we need to know this, that I really think the most truthful questions about raising white kids for racial justice are not about how we exactly map and measure it. We get hung up on that because that part has to be figured out. But the most truthful questions aren't the practical ones of how we do it just right. I really think the most truthful questions have to do with whether or not we'll just try and be brave. Because raising kids for racial justice requires we expose them to hard things. It requires us to create space for them to move into their own relationship with injustice, to allow them to feel its ache. And that's hard, because it's about letting our kids' hearts get broken. But I'm convinced it's also the most life and future affirming choice that we could make, because it's the only way white kids in this generation will remain human enough to recognize and fight for the humanity of their fellow humans whose lives actually are at stake in this system we're living in. And so with all the uncertainty and the awkward and the fears and even the tears, I'm convinced that my children's humanity and the humanity of all children is absolutely worth it. So amen, let's do it. Thanks.
There is something that I want to tell you. The white parents' approach while teaching their children about racism, it's different with the black community. We, black people, especially in the United States, have grown knowing that racism really affects everything, and they really know this. But now, I'm not being biased, but this is just the truth. Trust me, this is just the truth. And if you think I'm lying, I will allude to a book that I'll tell you to go and check about it. The article was written by Aisha M. Orzoko, Lapre, Cynthia, Garcia Cole, and Jennifer Marks. These are the people who wrote this article, Talking to Our Children About Race, a study of parental racial sterilization messages in the early years. And they have also indicated this, right? So, white parents' approach is color blindness. They are teaching their children not to see color, which is good, But remember, the society that the children are raised. Race affects everything, just like I said, from politics from sports and games, from movies, like from economy, like generally everything. Race and racism really is a matter in the United States. So teaching your children to be a colorblind, that's the problem. Let them know we have black people. And these are the things that black people went through. Let them know the history. These are what black people went through. And now, if you meet a black person, you don't need to tell them this. You don't need to tell them that. You can't say, you can't be teaching your children to say that, oh, let the child be colorblind. Yet, the system itself is not colorblind. The system is white privileged, and this is not something which is happening today. This is not something which is happening in the past. It has always been happening. So that's what I would like to say, that the question of ignoring race, I don't think is good. We need to tell the kids, let them know, let them grow knowing, and applaud the black family, because the social racial theory tries to intersect between the white families and the black families. While the black families, they teach their children and tell them about race and tell them about blackness, because we have some parents, black parents, who teach their children and tell them that, you have brothers in Africa, you have brothers in Africa, and these people looks like you. And so sometimes they embrace their culture, they know their history. That's why we are taught slavery in schools. This is to remind us that there are some things which happened in the past that really needs to be corrected, right? So, amongst other things that I would like to talk about is that even if we are having these kids, let them teach them what is called racial sensitivity. Let them know that there are some things, if I say to this black kid, they will feel bad. There's some things, if I say to this white kid, they will feel bad, right? So I believe that we need to have a proper discussion about this issue. I also talked about, there is some studies that was done about the parental racial socialization, the theory that I was talking about. The study found that parents of color generally prepare their children to navigate a world where they might face racial discrimination. Conversely, white parents often lack strategies for such discussion due to unchallenged racial privilege, just what I've said. That's why you understand how a black parent handles the kid and how a white parent handles the kid. Totally, it's different, right? So you get to understand what's really happening here. So white parents' approach. For example, a white parent might refrain from discussing the racial implications of current events with their child, believing it promotes equality. However, this approach can leave children unprepared to recognize and address racial injustices. Do you see? Because if we say that we're going to be colorblind, we are also trying to close our eyes to things which happened to black people. And as a person who wants to be an activist, or as a person who really wants to practice things fairly, that's the first point to start with. Let them have the knowledge of really what is happening. Let them get to see what is really happening. So you understand that if you come out and tell them what really happens, they'll get to know, and they'll know their boundaries, and they'll understand, and they'll grow becoming better people. And maybe in the next coming 10 years, 5 years, there'll be a change. And that's where it starts with a good change, right? I would like to talk about impact of societal contexts. In a society where whiteness is normalized and privileged, white parents might not see the necessity of discussing race, thus perpetuating ignorance about racial issues. I've talked about it and I've said about it. Generally, I believe that talking to people while they're still young about these issues, it's really, really important. As you understand, this shapes everything. everything from social, political, economic. So we need to grow in a society where people know challenges in raising anti-racist children. One challenge is countering societal messages that normalize whiteness and marginalize other races. For instance, white children might only see positive portrayals of white people in media, reinforcing biased view. And this was documented in an article which was written, Raising Anti-Racist White Children, a participatory action research study by Anne Russo and Melissa Dean. If you find time, go check out the articles and really get to understand all of these things. For me, I'm at home because I'm a student who studied African American literature. So probably there's some things that I'm not hearing for the first time. I'm also going to talk about the strategies for anti-racist parenting. Parents can use books and media featuring diverse characters to expose their children to different characters and perspectives. For example, reading books by authors of color or watching shows with diverse casts broaden a child's understanding. This is really, 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 really important. This is one of the best strategies of anti-racist parenting. Let the child watch different shows, which it is inclusive of different different races. If he or she is a white person, let them watch shows that as black people. Let them see. Let them understand the difference that we have. Let them normalize seeing these people. Let them normalize them hearing how they act. So when they get out there, they won't be shocked about the things that they were seeing. They won't be surprised about the things which are really happening about them, because that's where we start and that's where we create a good community. Invite the child. If the child likes reading, let them read books written by black authors. Let them read books written by white authors. Let them see the difference. Let them live in both worlds. Let them understand this, because this is really, really important. And it will shape how they'll act, and it will shape how they'll handle different people. And I believe that this is a good strategy for creating a good environment for the children and for a better future, because the children are the future of tomorrow, right? I'm also going to talk about parental reflection and action. Parents must also reflect on their own behaviors and attitudes. This might involve recognizing and addressing instances where they benefit from white privilege, such as receiving better service in stores. Parents can model anti-racist behavior by calling out unfair treatment and discussing these experiences with their children. This is why it gets interesting. There's a clip. There's this African child who was starving, literally. And when the kid saw this was a white kid who was seeing this on a TV. And when this white kid watched this, and he said, and she was a she, and she said that, oh, mom, okay. The parent told the kid, hey, baby, you see the way we are liking? You should be eating. Don't throw foods. This is a problem in this sense, okay? You are trying to create to this child that this given group of people, they are poor or they are something. Rather, what the parent should have done, the parent should have said, okay, baby, you see, this is Africa. These people went through a lot. Our people did this to them. They had their own food, they had everything, but something happened and they had to be poor. And when you talk to a child like that, it teaches them, okay, then the child will be curious. Now that this happened, what can we do to make it better? Now that's where we start by, talking about it. And that's where parental reflection and action comes really to make sense in these, in these stances. An article which was also written, White Parents, Black Schools, Structuring Racial Integration in the United States, 1954 to 1964, written by Eric A. Anushik, John F. Kane, and Stephen G. Rifkin. In the historical context and racial integration, one of them states that in the decade following the landmark decision, many white parents resisted sending their children to integrated schools. This resistance was often driven by deeply ingrained racial prejudices and desire to maintain social status. They also talked about behavioral dynamics. For instance, white parents might have moved to predominantly white suburbs, a practice known as white flight, to avoid integration. This maintained racial segregation and the unequal distribution for educational resources. Okay, white flight. I'm learning. I've learned from that. So white flight, you find that the parents isolate themselves and go to a white-dominated community and not staying to a mixed or black-dominated community. This is how this affects your child. You are also isolating your child from the knowledge that he's supposed to be having. So when you isolate them from the knowledge that they're supposed to be having, they'll start acting as a society that they are raised to. They'll not understand what's really happening, So the haze is a reflection of who the child will become, and they will not reason with other people because the places that they are raised, they're used to, acting in certain kind of ways, and in those ways that I'm talking about. The long-term effects of these problems, these historical actions have long-lasting impacts, contributing to persistent racial disparities in education today. Understanding this history is crucial for white parents committed to raising anti-racist children, as it helps them recognize the systemic nature of racial inequality. And so many other things that we can really talk about. I hope you found this video so helpful. If you're watching this video for the first time, you can consider subscribing to our channel, join our membership, and really get what we can offer you. For me, as I believe, every day is always a learning day. And if you're with me, trust me, you will be always learning. And with me also, I'll be always learning. And we be always learning. And it is a win for both of us, So I urge you, if you're watching this video and if you've reached this part and you haven't subscribed to our channel, I will urge you to really hit the subscribe button, join our membership if you can, and with time, you'll be proud to be a member of this channel. You'll be proud that you subscribe to this channel. And as you know, this is Why.te Stories, and I offer you nothing but just the best in the new week that we are coming to. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.